I'm working on a 2014 Chevy Malibu with a 2.5 liter engine in it. And the lady that owns this car had roadside assistance put a new battery in it, and they tested the battery and the alternator and said the alternator was bad, as well as the battery she had in it. She picked up an alternator and wants me to put it in for her, and she did buy a battery from roadside assistance. First thing I'm going to do is remove the mass airflow sensor. Then I'm going to remove the hose clamp for the intake, and then the engine cover. There's a look at the alternator. It should be a pretty easy job. You just have to snake it out through the top, watching out for the fuel lines. I'm going to remove the serpentine belt, and to do that I'm going to use a 1/2-inch drive ratchet. First thing I'm going to do is remove the negative battery terminal. Never want to replace a alternator with the battery hooked up. Set that aside. Make sure it's pushed down far enough so it's not going to accidentally touch the negative post again. Remove the air cleaner housing. And while I'm in here, I'm going to check the condition of the air filter. Actually looks pretty good. Then I'm going to remove the air intake and use a 1/2-inch drive ratchet as the serpentine belt removal tool. Pull off the belt. Make sure you take note of how it loops around. Three T27 Torx bit screws holding down the engine cover, and then you have to remove the oil filler cap. Pull the engine cover off and then replace the oil filler cap so no debris gets in there. Pull the serpentine belt off the alternator. And then there are two 13mm bolts holding the alternator on, and one 13mm nut that goes on a stud, and the stud coming from the engine block helps hold the alternator in place while you're installing it. And then there's one connector and the power connector, and then the cable that comes from the battery to the back of the alternator takes a 13mm nut. I'm going to change the angle from down below so you can get a better look of where the bolts are and what the connector looks like. But it's real simple. There are two 13mm bolts, one 13mm nut or the stud, and then one 13mm nut that holds on the power cable. And then one control wire, a set of control wires that just unplugs. Here is a better look at the wires you unplug. You just push in the little tab and it pulls right out. Pull the rubber boot off the stud that holds the power wire, and that's going to take a 13mm. So first thing I'm going to do is remove the bottom bolt. And all these take 13 millimeters. Pull that out. Next, remove the top 13 millimeter bolt. I love this design where it has a stud with a nut on it. That way you can hold the alternator in place after you remove all the 2 bolts and the nut. Makes it easier to pull out. This car has less than 20,000 miles on it. I'm really surprised how low the miles are for a 2014. And last but not least, take off this 13 millimeter nut that holds it to the stud connected to the engine block. There's a ton of room to work in this car. And just pull the alternator off and sneak it through the top of the engine. Be careful of the fuel line and the evap line up here. It's a tight fit, but it fits pretty comfortably through that little opening. You do need that extra little bit of room by removing the engine cover, and that gives you just enough room to pull this thing out. And there it is. Pull out the new one, and she did buy this from a parts store, so you just want to inspect it, make sure that it's the right one, that the pulley's the same, the mounting points are the same, and the connections on the back are the same. You also want to look to see if the amperage is the same. Looks perfect. Even came with a new nut. Ultima. Sneak this back in. Be careful of the fuel line and the evap line. And this is the part about this job I like the most, is the stud. You're able just to slip the alternator on there and then put the nut on the stud, and it makes it easy to line up and install the alternator. This is an aluminum block, so you always want to start it by hand first. And I like starting both of the studs by hand first before you get too far in. It makes it easier to line up the bottom one. Put the bottom bolt in. And as you can see, the movement of the alternator allows just a 1/4 inch or so of movement in order to get it lined up correctly. Tighten them all down. I'm going to torque them to factory spec. I'm going to reinstall the power cable. It is really hard to film this part. Put the nut back on. Here's a good look at the nut that holds the power cable to the alternator. And now I'm going to tighten it down. Get it as tight as I can with my hand, and then tighten it down with a deep socket. And you want to make sure you put the rubber boot back over it to protect it. Last thing to do with the electrical part of it is plug in the connector. When you're doing this, you are doing everything by feel, so just take your time. It only goes in one way. And you'll feel it snap when it connects correctly. Next thing I'm going to do is put the serpentine belt over the pulley. And then make sure it's routed correctly through the pulleys and the tensioner. Pull up on the ratchet, put the serpentine belt over the pulley. Check everything with my hand. Now I'm just going to double check everything. Serpentine belt's routed correctly over the pulley, over the tensioner, over the alternator. Alternator's hooked up. Bolts are torqued down. Connector and power wire are hooked up. Now I'm going to reinstall the air intake. It just clips right in. Push down on it to make sure it's seated correctly. Install the air filter, and then the air filter cover. Back half slips in back half of the air filter cover slips in this hook thing, and then you just push down on it. Tighten down all the screws. Now I'm going to reroute the mass airflow sensor, resecuring it to the air intake lid for the air filter, and then it routes underneath the hose for the air intake. Make sure it clicks in there, and then you want to push down on the red tab, the red safety tab. Everything's tightened down. Mass airflow sensor's hooked up. Hose is tight. Serpentine belt looks good. Now I'm going to reinstall the engine cover. Put on the oil filler cap. Put the 3 T27 Torx bit screws in and tighten them down. I'm going to reconnect the negative battery cable and tighten that down with a 10mm socket. Quick start, make sure everything runs good. Bell's not squeaking, everything looks good. I'm going to take the old alternator into O'Reilly's to get it tested. But the first thing I'm going to do is give it a quick test drive. Everything ran good. No noises, no squeaks. Everything works the way it should. Oh, and there's my favorite car. I'm going to back this back into the garage, hook the battery up to the battery charger because the battery was completely dead. I suspect that the roadside assistance, when they installed the battery's defective, which has actually happened to me before, because I'm going to take this alternator to O'Reilly's. I'm going to see if they'll let me record them testing it on the machine. They'll test them for free. My part, what are you doing this?
I just have to finish. First, I also have to find the clamp to use. I haven't had to do a clamp on this one.
Oh, it's not going yet?
Yeah. I don't on the camera.
The machine's going to completely run through all the tests. It's going to check the brushes,
Where's testing?
all the components. With only under 20,000 miles, I really don't suspect it's bad. And it passed, so it's still good.
Here's
So I'm going to take this
details
back
and results.
to the lady that owns the car and see what she wants to do. And she at least needs a new battery. If you like this content, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.